There was a rosary on the kitchen table, not hanging from a rearview mirror, not tucked in a drawer between old receipts and keys he no longer recognized. Set out flat, deliberately, as though someone had placed it there to remember what they had lost and had then walked away without picking it up. The man sitting across from me had not prayed it in 11 years. He told me that plainly without shame, which was itself a kind of sign. He had come because his marriage was gone, his oldest daughter had stopped speaking to him, and something he could not name it, but he felt it most clearly at 3 a.m. when he woke and could not get back to sleep, had been following him since his mother died. He used the word following and then went quiet. He was 51 years old. He looked older. His hands were still. I am a Thomistic philosopher and one of the few trained exorcists still operating in the West. I did not choose this work. It chose me, or rather, I was assigned it by obedience. And I have learned over 3 decades of ministry that obedience is itself a form of spiritual armor. The priest who does not want this work, who finds it heavy and strange and costly, is often better suited to it than the one who seeks it out of fascination. My name is Chad Ripperger. I have sat across from men and women whose stories sound like the one I am about to describe. The cases are composite observations from decades of ministry. The patterns are not invented. What he told me over the next 2 hours was not, in the strict theological sense, unusual. That is itself the problem, the fact that I can say that without exaggeration. A rosary on the table, 11 years of distance from the sacraments. A death in the family that no one had properly mourned before God, no mass offered, no final anointing, the soul sent into eternity without the church's formal prayers. A decade of slow erosion. The Sunday Mass dropped first, then the monthly confession, then the prayers at meals, then the prayers at night, and then the marriage began to fracture at the joints slowly at first, then with a speed that surprised him. His mother had practiced folk healing in her village of origin before she came to this country. She had mixed Catholic piety with something older. She had not understood the nature of what she was doing. She had not known the line she was crossing. She had loved her son completely. She had also opened a door, and doors, once opened, do not close on their own. He asked me a question that I have been asked many times. He said, "Is it too late? Can what was lost come back?" I want to answer that question with precision, because the answer is yes, but not in the way the internet will tell you. There is a category of spiritual harm that looks from the inside like a permanent condition. The peace is gone. The faith feels cold in the hand, like ash the morning after a fire. The family is scattered. The years have accumulated on the wrong side of the ledger. And a certain kind of spirituality, not Catholic, not Thomistic, not grounded in what. For 400 years, the church provided the laity with specific prayers to address situations in their homes that they could not explain. Most parishes stopped teaching them after 1965. Now, they have all been compiled into a concise, practical guide. Keep it near the door and read the first page tonight. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first pinned comment. What I actually know about how the demonic operates will tell you to perform some act of return. Send it back. Reverse the transfer. Counter the curse with a louder counter prayer. Return it to the sender. I have sat with people who tried this. Not only did it fail to help them, it made the legal ground worse. The act of retaliation, however it is framed and whatever name is given to it, is still an act of occult engagement. You are not fighting fire with fire. You are adding fuel to a fire that was already burning in your house. The Catholic answer is not retaliation, it is sacramental remedy. What you actually want is not for your enemy to suffer. What you want is for the foothold to collapse, for the legal basis upon which the oppression stands to be removed. And there is a way for this to happen, grounded in the actual theology of how the demonic operates, not in a spirituality imported from a tradition that does not understand what it is fighting. Aquinas treats the fallen angels in the Summa Theologiae, questions 50 through 64 of the first part. The intelligence of the fallen angel is retained intact. The will is fixed and immovable. A being that was created before the fall with an intelligence ordered toward truth and a will ordered toward goodness now directs that same intelligence and that irreversible will entirely toward destruction. It is not stupid. It is not impulsive. It observes over decades. It waits. It catalogs weaknesses. What Aquinas identifies as the entry point, the defect in the spiritual armor, is made available through serious sin, through formal engagement with occult practice, or through what the tradition calls generational inheritance. Patterns of spiritual compromise that pass through a family line, not genetically but legally, in the way that a debt can pass. A contract that one generation signed can bind the next generation unless it is formally dissolved. The Church's tradition acknowledges this. Exodus 20:5 speaks of iniquities visited upon the third and fourth generation. This is not predestination. It is not fate. It is the recognition that human souls exist inside families, inside histories, and that what one generation opened, the next may inherit as a legal condition until a priest, operating with the authority of Christ, closes it. The man's mother had not cursed him. She had loved him with everything she had, but she had engaged with something that now had standing in his household. The Catholic tradition classifies afflictions of this kind: infestation, when the demonic affects a place; obsession, when it produces external assault on a person; oppression, when it begins to suppress the spiritual and even physical capacity of a soul. He was at the oppression stage. The marriage had fractured under the accumulated weight. His daughter's silence was not arbitrary. His inability to pray was not simple laziness, though laziness had made the situation worse over the years. Something was actively working against his peace, and it had been working since the door was opened in his mother's kitchen, perhaps 30 years before he sat across from me. The Curé d'Ars, who died on 4 August 1859, dealt with what he called le grappin, the old claw. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote more than a dozen questions on how fallen angels operate. Most Catholics have never read one line of it. This archive gathers that teaching, the 1,614 rite, and 4 centuries of documented cases into a single reference. Read it slowly, 1 chapter a night. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first posted comment. The demon harassed him physically for decades. Most of the disturbances concentrated precisely around the periods when the greatest number of souls were converting under his direction. The pattern is consistent across the authenticated cases I know. The demonic concentrates its effort where a soul is near return, or where a return would bear substantial fruit. The Curé d'Ars' confessional line stretched for miles across the French countryside. People came from Paris, from Lyon, from abroad. The harassment intensified with the conversions. The man sitting across from me had come at the worst moment of his life, not because the situation was without hope, because he was close. I want to be honest about the limits of what I am claiming. What I describe are composite observations from decades of ministry. I do not know the full dimensions of any individual case. I do not know everything about your situation. What I know is what I have seen consistently across a pattern that repeats with enough regularity that I can describe it, and what the Church's tradition gives us to address it. What happened over the weeks of ministry that followed was not dramatic in the way films have conditioned people to expect. There was no shouting, there was no theater. He went to confession. He received absolution from a sound priest. He received the Eucharist for the first time in 11 years. He brought a priest to his home for the formal house blessing. He removed 3 objects he had kept from his mother's home, objects associated with her folk practice, things he had held on to out of grief and sentiment, and had them disposed of properly. He began the rosary. He did not feel immediately the consolation he had been half expecting. What he reported was a word: lighter. He said his chest felt lighter, the way a room feels lighter after a window is opened in winter. That is often how it begins, not with thunder, but with a window. The night after he first prayed the rosary in that kitchen, with the beads flat on the table where he had placed them years before, he slept through the night for the first time in 4 years. Joel's prophecy is specific. I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten, the locust, the hopper, the destroying caterpillar. The image is agricultural. The land was stripped. The harvest failed for consecutive seasons. And the promise is restoration, not the erasure of what happened, not the magical cancellation of consequence, but a harvest so full that the lean years are redeemed by what comes after them. This is the Catholic understanding of what God's grace can do with human loss. He does not pretend the years did not happen. He restores them. The shame is removed. The harvest is enough. The Son, in Luke 15, did not recover his Father's love by demanding justice or by performing an act of spiritual counterattack. He came back. He turned and walked the road. And the Father, who had been watching every day down the length of the road, ran. Luke includes that detail deliberately. In the cultural world of first century Palestine, a man of dignity and property did not run in public. It was beneath him. Luke puts the run in the text because it is theologically important. The waiting was not passive, the watching was constant, and the moment the Son turned, the Father's movement was immediate. The foothold of the far country collapsed the moment the face turned homeward. This is the structure of restoration, not retaliation, return. I have been in this ministry long enough to have watched many prodigals make that walk. The walk is never clean. There is always grief, grief for the years, grief for the children, grief for the version of the marriage that could have existed if the turning had come sooner, but the foothold collapses. It collapses because the soul stepped back into the sacramental life of the church and the legal condition for the oppression ceased to exist. Isaiah says plainly, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." This is not because you have neutralized the weapon. It is because you have returned to the jurisdiction where weapons of that kind have no standing. Let me speak with precision about what the restoration actually looks like in practice, because it is not symbolic. Confession is the primary instrument. John 20:23, "Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven." The absolution given in that sacrament is juridical, not therapeutic. It removes the legal ground. A soul living in habitual mortal sin gives the demonic something to stand on in the same way that a legal claim requires a factual basis. The moment that basis is removed, really removed through valid absolution, the standing collapses. I have been present when this shift occurred. Not in every case at the same speed. Sometimes the recovery is spread across months of consistent sacramental practice. But the direction changes in the confessional. The Eucharist is not a devotional gesture. It is the real presence of Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity received physically into the person. The early church called it the medicine of immortality. The demonic cannot remain in the presence of this reality, not over time, not in a soul that is receiving it worthily and with preparation. The Roman ritual of 1614, not the substantially weakened 1999 revision, which requires a bishop's explicit prior permission before a formal exorcism can be performed, treats the Eucharist as central to the liberation of souls from demonic influence. The 1999 rites permission requirement is not a small administrative adjustment. Padre Pio bore the stigmata from 20 September 1918 until his death 50 years later. He was investigated, suspended from public ministry, and restricted in his movement for years at a stretch. He continued, "The institutional caution that constrained him was not without its own rationale, but the effect of that caution was to limit access to a charism that souls needed. We are living now through the consequences of a similar restriction applied across the entire mechanism of exorcism." Dr. Richard Gallagher, the psychiatrist who has collaborated formally with exorcists over many years, noted in his published work that the cases he assessed did not resolve through psychiatric intervention alone, even when the intervention was thorough and extended. He is a careful observer. His witness is not charismatic enthusiasm. It is reluctant professional testimony, and it is worth something to the person who needs a bridge between clinical reality and theological claim. The man I described reached his daughter. Not quickly, months passed. She noticed something different in his voice when they spoke on the phone, a steadiness that had not been there before, and she agreed to meet for dinner. The dinner became what it needed to become over time. There was grief in the reunion because some things cannot be rewound. But Joel does not promise a rewinding. He promises that the harvest will be sufficient. And it was sufficient. Now, I want to say something about why this pattern is so common. because the man I described is not a rare case. He is a type, and the type did not appear without cause. The catechetical failure that followed the Second Vatican Council, which ran from 1962 to 1965, produced a generation of Catholics who were not taught what the Eucharist is. A survey conducted in 2019 found that 69% of self-identified American Catholics do not believe in the real presence. 69%. This is not a sociological footnote about religious trends. This is the collapse of the central defense. If you do not know what you are carrying to the altar rail, if the monstrance on the altar is, to your practical understanding, a symbol of spiritual importance rather than the body of Christ himself, you will not approach it with the dispositions that make it effective. You will receive it casually, or you will stop receiving it entirely, or you will receive it in mortal sin without a thought, which is a different category of problem altogether. The formation of priests in the decades after the council treated the language of spiritual warfare as unsophisticated. The demonic was addressed, where it was addressed at all, as metaphor for social evil or psychological dysfunction. The exorcism prayers were removed from the baptismal rite in the post-conciliar revision, not because the Church had formally decided the demonic was metaphorical, but because the theological culture of the moment found them embarrassing. The 1999 rite formalized this embarrassment institutionally by requiring episcopal approval that is almost never granted. The result is a church that has, in practical terms, disarmed itself of one of its oldest protections at the precise moment when that protection was most needed. No-fault divorce became California law in 1969. Most of the rest of the country followed within 15 years. The assault on the family as the domestic church is not a separate issue from the spiritual crisis I am describing. The family is the primary site of catechesis, the first place a child learns whether God is real, the first formation of the habit of prayer. When the family dissolves and the dissolution is processed as a lifestyle adjustment, when no one names the spiritual dimension of the wound, when the children are handed from household to household without a theology of suffering or a practice of the sacraments to hold them, the children reach adulthood without the armor they need. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about the consequences of dismantling the structure without replacing it with anything. I hold this carefully. I do not know your situation. I do not know every dimension of the cases I describe. I know the pattern, and I am telling you what the pattern shows, because you are the one who has to decide what to do with it before God. Here's what I want you to do. Not eventually, this week. Make your confession. If it has been a year, go. If it has been 11 years, go this week. The line at the confessional is not long enough to be a reason to wait. Find a sound priest, one who believes what the church teaches, who will give you a real examination of conscience and real absolution. The confessional is a legal instrument. The absolution removes the basis of the oppression. Nothing replaces it. Receive the Eucharist worthily. If you are in a state of grace after your confession, receive the Eucharist at Mass. Not once, as though you have checked a box, regularly. Make this a weekly discipline at minimum. The real presence of Christ received into your body is not a comfort measure. It is the condition under which the demonic cannot establish a long-term foothold. Have your home blessed. Bring a priest in for a full house blessing. Place a blessed crucifix over the main door. Put an image of Our Lady in the common room, the kitchen, the living room, the place where the family gathers. Set holy water fonts at the entrances and use them. If there are objects in your home connected to occult practice, tarot cards, a Ouija board, statues from syncretic traditions, materials from any form of folk healing or conjure, remove them. Have a priest dispose of them if possible. Have the space re-blessed afterward. This is not theatrical. It is the same logic as removing a tool the enemy was using. Consecrate your family formally to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This is an act with canonical and spiritual weight. It changes what the household is legally ordered toward, and the protection that follows from it is consistent enough across cases that I recommend it in almost every situation. Pray the Rosary daily, not as an emotional practice, as a combat discipline. The intercession of the Blessed Virgin, invoked through the Rosary, has a documented place in the church's tradition of liberation ministry that cannot be compressed into a few sentences. Pray it every day. 5 decades if 15 is beyond your current capacity, but pray it. Seek spiritual direction from a sound priest, a confessor who knows your soul over time, who will hold you to a real rule of life, who believes what the church teaches. This is not optional for anyone in serious spiritual difficulty. It is the difference between recovery and relapse. Build community with other practicing Catholics. The demonic works on isolated souls. The parish, the confraternity, the small circle of families who pray together and hold each other accountable. This is not nostalgia for a pre-modern world. This is armor. Use it. Form your children. The catechetical failure I described is being repaired one household at a time by parents who know what they believe and pass it on deliberately at the dinner table in evening prayer in the way they approach Sunday morning. Your children need to see you receive the sacraments. They need to see you kneel. They need to hear the rosary prayed aloud in the house where they are being formed. This is the most consequential thing you can do, not for your own spiritual recovery, but for the generation that comes after it. The Arian crisis of the 4th century consumed the episcopate of the church. Bishop after bishop signed documents denying the full divinity of Christ. There was one who held, his name has become the phrase for holding a position when no one else will. Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. He was exiled 5 separate times. He died in office in his see after the tide turned. The faith survived, not because the institutions held, but because a few people held within the institutions. The French Revolution killed 10,000 priests in less than 3 years. The faith survived. Communism martyred more Catholics in the 20th century than Rome martyred in the first 3 combined. The faith survived, not because optimism won, because holiness is stubborn. The hope I am offering you is not the hope that your life will become easy or that the grief will dissolve painlessly. It is the theological virtue of hope, not optimism, not positive thinking, but the anchor that holds in the storms that optimism cannot survive. The anchor is the resurrection of Christ, the promise of his church, and the word of Joel. The years the locust ate will be restored. The harvest will be enough. The rosary on the kitchen table is not a relic of a faith that is gone. It is a sign that the faith is recoverable, and the distance between you and its recovery is exactly one confession away. God is with us. He has always been with us. The question is whether we will be with him. There is a category of case I have not yet addressed in this series, the soul who was never baptized, who comes to this ministry from entirely outside the church, carrying something inherited from generations of spiritual compromise, and who receives the sacrament of baptism partway through the liberation process. What occurs in the room at the moment that sacrament is administered is something I want to describe carefully. That is where we are going next.